just say hi to that poor girl? She was excited to see you. If you have a Bible with you this morning, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is where we'll be. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Did anybody grow up around one of these? Maybe? Yes, one of these? Anybody? Nothing said in my day that we've made it in life quite like having a 20-foot tall bowl in your yard. Young people, if you're unaware what these are, these were the first satellite TV dishes, and hands down in the late 80s, early 90s, these were the status symbol of all status symbols. Like if you saw one of these in somebody's yard, you did one of two things. You either went home and cried yourself to sleep at night because you didn't have one, or you desperately tried to become friends with someone who did have one. Because what is the purpose of life if you don't have 7,126 channels to choose from on the TV, with 6,987 of them showing the exact same thing? Like, my cousin had one of these, and since we didn't grow up in the same area, my brother and I would go to my cousin's house for several days at a time, either during summer break or maybe on some weekends. And like kids, we spent most of our time outside or prank calling her neighbors who had a party line with her, which if you also don't know what that is, you should ask your parents. It's cool stuff. But anyway, if we weren't doing one of those things, we would be inside scanning the satellite TV channels. And most of the time, we would run across really boring stuff like news or infomercials or obscure television shows that no one watched. One day, my brother was handling the remote, and he's the oldest of the three of us. And he landed on this channel that forever changed my life. And I am convinced it probably has something to do with how I turned out. There wasn't much to the channel. The background of the screen was this deep, dark purple color. Shelley, that's not working for some crazy reason. This deep, dark purple color, and at the top of this was just a heading that said, "We're coming for you." And over the top of this, there was this deep, dark, creepy, alien-like music that continued to play. And this creepy, alien-like voice continued to say the words coming across the screen. Most of the words were names. And though we didn't recognize these names at first, after a little while, my brother said, "Hey guys, check this out." And so we did. And slowly but surely, the names started changing into names we did recognize. At first, it was my grandpa's name, and then our uncle's name, and then my mom's name. And I'm not just talking about first names, I'm talking first and last names, some being the maiden names of the women in our lives. It was creepy. Now, I can't explain what happened that day. I still don't know. But it got me wondering, do you think that's how people outside the church think of us inside the church? I mean, think about some of the creepy stuff we say. Things like, "Welcome home." "We're glad you're here so we can speak truth into your life and love on you." What is that? Like, ew, go love on somebody else, right? And it sounds like the creepy, like, "we're coming for you" thing of my childhood. 2 Sundays ago, we began this series, Life is Better Connected. And it's a series about our church's mission statement. The first week, we posed a rebuttal question to this idea, and that was, is it really? Is it really better to be connected to other people? And biblically, the answer is yes. And within the church, it's better when we are connected and do certain things together. Acts 2:42 mentions 4 things that the church is supposed to spend our time doing. We're supposed to learn and apply the Bible together. We're all supposed to contribute to the common goal, which is called fellowship. We're supposed to eat meals together, including the Lord's Supper. And we're supposed to pray. And it seems to present this idea that when the church does these four things well and does them together, that results will happen. Last week, Titus shared some differences between our culture and the culture in which the Bible and church was kind of born into. And it was the idea of collectivism versus individualism. And a lot of us probably sat here thinking, what kind of creepy socialist church did I come to today, right? No? No one thought that? Okay. As individualists, as Americans, we approach church with a disadvantage. We often think of church as things that it isn't. We think of church as an hour on Sunday morning and oftentimes a building. And because of that, we think church is an event or a place that we can either choose to go to or choose not to go to. And so we walked away last week thinking, how can individualists become a family? And Titus so wisely said last Sunday, it's by learning to depend on one another more, by choosing church family as the most important group of connections in our lives. Now, those two lessons that we've covered over the last 2 weeks, kind of difficult to apply. And they really push against the grain of who we are. And so, as if those aren't difficult enough already, we're going to add a third layer to that today. And that is, if life really is better connected, and if we commit to doing these things together as we're designed to do, and if the church grows as a family, then the natural next thing is that will spill over into the community in which we find ourselves. And so today's big question is, what can a connected church do for its community? And to answer this question, at least in part, I would like to look at a section of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 today. 1 Thessalonians is a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to Christians in the city of Thessalonica. And as you'll see today, this church, this family, had issues just like any other church and family. And one of their big issues was a little awkward. Speaking of which, we are thinking about getting some new church t-shirts designed, and I would like your help deciding which ones we're going to order. 4 choices today. The first is go love on somebody. Look, all in favor? Okay. Next one, just it is what it is cringe. Okay, all in favor? Yeah. And third option, my personal favorite, is we're coming for you. If the church in Thessalonica would have handed t-shirts out at their welcome center, they would have read something like this: we're quitting work for Jesus. Okay? For real, in Thessalonica, someone must have been preaching about the second coming of Jesus a lot, because this church kind of adopted the mindset that Jesus would come back any moment. And while that is or was potentially true for them, it's also potentially true for us. We don't know when Jesus is coming back. But this church in Thessalonica, they ran with this idea so much that they thought, well, if Jesus is coming back any moment, then we might as well just not go to work tomorrow. I mean, who wants to go to work if you don't have to, right? And they also thought, who needs money? Who needs a place to stay? Who needs to put food on the table? Who needs to provide their own means? If Jesus is coming back tomorrow, then none of this matters. And so collectively, many of the Christians in the city of Thessalonica just decided to quit work. What do you think happened next? A couple days in, and they realized, oh no, I guess we were wrong. But don't worry. The Christians in Thessalonica knew the lesson that Titus correctly taught last week, and that is this: when you're connected to a church family, you can depend on that church family. And they did. They clung to the hope of Jesus' return to the point where they became needy. And they weren't just seeking out help from their congregation. 1 Thessalonians kind of presents the idea that they became leeches on their own community, asking and begging for help. And so the Apostle Paul sent them a letter and said, yeah, we're not doing that. All right, we're going to check out a couple words that he said to them. This is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. I want to zero in on verses 9 through 12, and we're going to read those together, or in one fell swoop. Here we go. Verse 9 says this: but we don't need to write to you about the importance of loving each other, For God himself has taught you to love one another. Indeed, you already show your love for all the believers throughout Macedonia. Even so, dear brothers and sisters, we urge you to love them even more. Make it your goal to live a quiet life, minding your own business and working with your hands, just as we instructed you before. Then people who are not believers will respect the way you live, and you will not need to depend on others. So, what I want to do is back up to these 4 verses and kind of just approach them a little bit at a time. Because I think in these verses, what Paul is doing is showing us that there are 2 main arenas of our lives, 2 main areas where we operate. And we have to figure out how we're supposed to act in each one of those arenas. The first arena is how we act toward those inside the church family. Verses 9 and 10 break that down. Jump back to verse 9. We already read it once, but we're going to do it again. It says, we don't need to write to you about the importance of loving one another. This word here that Paul uses to describe how we love each other is probably one that's pretty familiar to you. Philadelphia's, which reminds us of the city of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, right? And so Paul says, we don't need to tell you how to act toward one another. This is supposed to be automatic. This is supposed to be a given. Now, when Paul uses this idea of brotherly love, he's speaking to a group of people that grew up thinking that you only act this way toward your immediate family. And on some level, we get that, right? We love our actual brothers and sisters from the same mothers and misters like we do no other person, all right? Like your siblings can be your worst enemy one day and your absolute best friend the next. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Yeah, you do, right? And you still love them no matter what. And Paul, he hijacks this idea from this love that you share with your immediate family, and he then turns it over to the church and says, this is then how you are to love each other, like brothers and sisters. We're a family. And even when there are days that we can't stand each other, we still are going to be there for one another. And so this concept, Paul says, I don't need to remind you of this. This is automatic. You should already know this. You should be living this way. It is assumed that we will treat one another like brothers and sisters. Why? It's not because we always get along. It's not because we always see eye to eye. It's because we have a common bond based on one thing. And that one thing is that we belong to the same Father. And that's kind of what Paul says here at the end of verse 9. He says, for God, the Father himself, has taught you how to love one another. Now, what I want you to see there in verse 9 is that in the Greek language, Paul goes from talking about Philadelphia, phileo love, to talking about a different kind of love known as agape. This type of love is different. This type of love requires sacrifice. It doesn't consider whether or not you think someone is worthy of your love. It doesn't matter if you like them or not. It doesn't matter if you see eye to eye with them. It doesn't matter if they have the wrong political signs in their yards. Hello, right? It doesn't matter because God has taught you that you are obligated to love people in a sacrificial way. I want to ask you an uncomfortable question this morning. What criteria do you use to determine who you will help financially? I want to throw out 3 possibilities, and you don't want or need to answer these audibly or even with a show of hands. Just 3 scenarios, and I want you to think through whether or not you'd help these people. Need number 1. Let's say you find out that your local food pantry has been inundated with requests lately. And every month, their food supply is short. So you hear of this need and you think, well, I want to help. And so you send them a cash donation via mail. But you think, well, just money alone, I could do better than that. And so you think, I'll go to Sam's and I'll buy $400 worth of groceries, shelf-stable stuff, and I'll deliver it to the food pantry. And when you get there, they're like, dude, thanks, but could you come help us sometime? And you're like, okay, I guess. So you volunteer to help on distribution day. You show up for that month's distribution day, and they say, well, since you're a strapping individual, would you help load the boxes of stuff into people's vehicles? And you say, yeah, I can do that. And so throughout the day, you're loading boxes into vehicles, and lo and behold, this lady backs up her vehicle to the food pantry, and someone tells you to put a box of food in it. And so you turn, and the vehicle that she's driving is a brand new, fully loaded, pristine 2024 Jeep Grand Wagoneer, all right? And you're like, those are pretty expensive vehicles, but okay. She steps out of her car, and she's fully decked out in Lululemon, all right? And she's got good, nice jewelry on, and you can tell she just went to the salon, and her hair looks awesome. Would you continue donating to that organization and or volunteering with them? Don't answer out loud, okay? Second scenario. Let's say you hear of a young local man who's recently diagnosed with cancer. He's married, he has kids, they both work, but because of this diagnosis, they are really strapped. Aside from all the normal expenses that they have on a regular basis, now they have added costs like hotels and fuel expenses and eating out because they're on the road so much with treatments. And so you hear of this need, and you think, maybe I could contribute to their GoFundMe account. Would you? Don't answer out loud. Need number 3. Let's say Northwest Missouri, other side of the state, you hear of a church building that is completely wiped out by a tornado. Now, this church had insurance, but because of the building's age, the policy didn't completely pay to replace what they lost. This congregation has upped their giving, all right? Everybody collectively is given about 25% more than they usually do, but they're still short. And so the elders of this church in Northwest Missouri decide that they're going to send out letters to other congregations around northern Missouri asking for donations. And let's pretend that our church gets one. Do you think our church should send them a check to help them rebuild their building? Don't answer out loud. What criteria do you use? Let me back up. What criteria do you use to determine who you'll help? In other words, like 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 says, who deserves your obligation to love them? Does someone's age or stage in life play into it? Will you only give to people you like and know? Is the way they spend money? Does that determine whether or not you'll give? Do you only give to other Christians? Does where someone lives make a difference? Verse 10, look what Paul says here. He says, indeed, you already show your love for all the believers throughout Macedonia. Now, the obligation to love became a reality for the Christians in Thessalonica. They heard of some needs throughout their region, which was Macedonia was an area of about 25,000 square miles, the same size as northern Missouri, so north of the Missouri River. If you heard of Christians struggling in, say, Centralia, would you help them after the football game Friday night? Would you send money to Christians struggling in, let's say, the town of LaGrange or Maryville or Chillicothe? That's basically what the Christians in Thessalonica were doing. And Paul says, I want you to keep doing it. I want you to send them more money. And the phrase he uses at the end of verse 10, he says, we urge you to love them even more. It means to exceed what is necessary. Now, obviously, you and I know that we can't send money to every person and organization who needs it. Because each of us, and even the church collectively, only has so much money, right? But Paul is basically saying that our love and support for other Christians should go above and beyond what we'd be willing to do for anyone else. And the reason is because the way we care for each other within the church has a way of convincing the community that's outside the church that maybe they should give church a try. Maybe there's something to this faith thing. And if we care for one another so well, it has a way of convincing our towns that church might actually be worth it. Now, verses 9 and 10 tell us how to act toward one another. I want you to see that verses 11 and 12 talk about the second arena of our lives, and that is how we're supposed to act toward people outside our church. And as we begin verse 11 again, I want you to see that this verse is dependent upon verse 10, meaning that the way we act toward one another has an effect on the way we act toward those outside the church. They are dependent on the two. And so when Paul says we urge you to love them even more, he says that that same ambition, that urge to love each other should carry over to our community. Look what he says in verse 11. He says, make it your goal to live a quiet life, minding your own business and working with your hands, just as we instructed you before. Now, here's the cool thing about ambition. It's only mentioned in the New Testament 3 times. And ambition is something that only the Apostle Paul talks about. But there are 3 specific things that he says we should be ambitious in. One is what he says here in verse 11. The other 2 times are Romans 15, verse 20. He says, my ambition, he's talking about himself, my ambition has always been to preach the good news where the name of Christ has never been heard, rather than where a church has already been started by someone else. He mentions ambition again in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9. He says, therefore, we also have as our ambition, whether at home or absent, to be pleasing to God. So there are 3 things that Paul says we should be ambitious in. One is preaching the good news to people who haven't heard it. The second is please God with the way you live. And the third is what he says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 11. If you are the type of person that likes to make to-do lists, Paul is about to give you a really good to-do list as a Christian. You ready for this? The first thing he says is lead a quiet life. I can't help but think of a lady named Chris when I think of leading a quiet life. I first met Chris at church, and to me, I don't know how to say this politely, so I'm just going to say it. To me, Chris was just another old lady at church. You know what I'm talking about? Just another old lady. And I didn't know her at first. She was just another old lady, and I was a teenage boy, right? But after a while, I started to realize that Chris had specific roles that she filled within the church family and outside it. One was, Chris was the church janitor. And if she wasn't doing that, Chris was spending time often making meals for people and distributing them around the community. And if she wasn't doing that, she was probably gardening or spending her time with her one and only vice. You want to know what it was? Watching daytime soap operas. All right, so anyway, if Chris was around, it seemed that she had a way of loving people loudly, even though she lived such a quiet life. When Chris turned 85, some friends at church threw her a birthday party. And when I showed up, the biggest, loudest table at Chris's birthday party was not full of other old people. It was full of 20 and 30-something-year-olds. Why? Because though Chris lived a quiet life, she seemed to have a huge impact on teens and young adults. When Paul says to lead a quiet life, what he's referring to is not causing unnecessary disturbances in the community. And in other words, what he's saying is the way we sacrifice for our community must speak louder than any conflicts we create. And so as a church, I think there's a question that we should regularly ask ourselves, and that is this. When our community thinks of Shelbina Christian Church, do they think of a group who loves loudly or a group who creates conflict? As individuals, perhaps we should ask, how am I contributing to what the community thinks of this church? And so, again, to-do list that Paul's giving you. One is lead a quiet life. The second one is mind your own business. Anybody know somebody that loves to stick their nose in somebody else's business? Anybody one of those people? Okay, so anyway. While it's good to keep your nose out of other people's business and not spread other people's business, the verse that Paul mentions here would actually be better translated, tend to your own business affairs. Basically what Paul is saying is if you can provide for yourself, do it. If you have the physical and mental capacity to work, then keep your job. Pay your own bills, put food on your own table, and all of this leads to the next part of ambition, this next thing on his to-do list, and that is work with your hands. Now, most of the jobs in the ancient world involved manual labor. Not all of them, but most. In today's culture, people make money in lots of different ways. Some with their hands, some with their minds, some with a combination of both. But the point Paul is making is every job is a place where a Christian can and should make a difference. For every Christian, a job is more than a paycheck. It's an arena where our worship of Jesus becomes a very public thing. And so what he's basically saying is do your job in a way that shows faith in action. And Paul then, in verse 12, shares why we should do this. Look what he says, verse 12. Then people who are not believers will respect the way you live, and you will not need to depend on others. Wait a second. Didn't Titus just say last week that in the church we're supposed to depend on each other? And now Paul says, work in such a way so that you don't have to depend on others? Does the Bible contradict itself? Here, what Paul is saying is, work in such a way that the dependence within the church stays together, but the dependence on our community does not. In other words, we should take care of each other in such a way that the community says, I wish I had people in my corner like those people do. You see, those outside the church will respect us for it, is what Paul says. And this idea of you is, again, not singular, but plural. And so basically what this is saying is when all y'all do all y'all's job like all y'all supposed to be doing and worshiping Jesus with that, the community will be thankful that the church exists. With all this in mind, I want to back up in the story of the church in Thessalonica. A couple years before Paul wrote them this letter, he actually visited them in person. If you have your Bibles, flip backwards with me to Acts chapter 17. In Acts chapter 17, we see Paul is on a mission trip of sorts. He's with some other people, and they are going from city to city, preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ and trusting that the Holy Spirit will engage in people's lives in such a way that a church will be planted and will rise up from nothing. And in that mission trip, Paul comes to different cities. Acts chapter 17 verse 1 says, Paul and Silas traveled through the towns of Amphipolis and Apollonia and eventually came to Thessalonica. And in that city there was a Jewish synagogue. Let's pause there for a second. The Jewish synagogue was basically the Jewish people's version of a church building. And every single week they had worship services, not on Sundays, but on Saturdays, on the Sabbath day. Look what it says in verse 2. As was Paul's custom, he went to the synagogue service, and for 3 Sabbaths in a row, he used the scriptures to reason with the people. And so somehow or another, when Paul was visiting their synagogue, he had the opportunity to publicly speak 3 weeks in a row. And what Paul does is uses the Old Testament to convince the people that Jesus is the Messiah that the Old Testament promises. Look at verse 3. He explained the prophecies and proved that the Messiah must suffer and rise from the dead. And he said, this Jesus I'm telling you about, he's the Messiah. Some of the Jews who listened were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas along with many God-fearing Greek men and quite a few prominent women. In other words, in 3 weeks, this church rose up from nothing. It would have been an exciting, exhilarating thing, especially, it seems, for the city of Thessalonica. But not everybody thought so. Look at verse 5. It says, "But some of the Jews were jealous. So they gathered some troublemakers from the marketplace to form a mob and start a riot. They attacked the home of a man named Jason, searching for Paul and Silas so they could drag them out to the crowd. But not finding them there, they dragged out Jason and some of the other believers instead and took them before the city council. And they said, 'Paul and Silas have caused trouble all over the world, and now they are here disturbing our city too.'" This brings me back to the weird satellite TV channel from my childhood. That "we're coming for you" moment. And I think the idea is that the love of Christ expressed by the church can sometimes cause a disturbance in a community. And I might even change that word "can" to "should." I think we should love one another in such a way that it causes an uproar in our city. Maybe not a mob or a riot or where people are smashing windows, but it would be nice if the way we love each other spreads around this town in such a way that people want to know what in the world is going on there. You see, even when the church does good things, Acts chapter 17 kind of says that not everybody is going to like it. Not everybody is going to appreciate it, and not everyone is going to respond well to it. But that doesn't mean we should stop. When the church in Thessalonica received pushback and their community didn't like what they were doing, they decided they'd quit. They just folded up. They played it safe, and they sat around hoping that Jesus would come back soon. And Paul reminded them, just as he'd remind us, that the best way for Jesus to return and find us is not huddled in the corner somewhere, but going about our days with diligence and purpose. Not hysterical, not frantic, but calm, quiet, and useful. When those outside the church family see us rolling up with our cool "we're coming for you" t-shirts, they shouldn't feel intimidated. They should feel blessed. Does our church have a reputation of blessing our community? Is Shelbina and Shelbyville and Paris and Monroe and Lakenan and Lintner and all the other towns in between, are they thankful that we're here? You play a role in determining that. Will you pray with me? Father in heaven, we thank you that you have taught us how to love. We thank you that we have this new family in the church of brothers and sisters who we might not always get along with, who we might not always see eye to eye with, but we're committed to because we serve the same God and we have the same Father. And we thank you for being a father to each of us. God, as we figure out and learn how to love each other, I pray that that spills over to our community. I pray that when people see us rolling up with our cool church t-shirts on, that they won't be confused, that they won't be fearful, that they won't be cringed out, but instead will feel blessed because we're there. And God, I thank you that this church is committed to loving the community around us. And I pray, just as Paul did, that we will do that more and more. God, I pray that you will show us ways that we can do that in our own lives, in our own households, but I pray collectively as a church, we go out into the community and we love in such a way that it makes people ask, what's going on there? Why are their lives changing? Why do they live differently than us? And God, when they ask those questions, I pray that we'll be ready and willing to share and answer with them. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.